Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do at AvLaw, because a large portion of your business is consulting airports, airspace for tall buildings. What does that go like? Why do clients come to you? And what do you give them?
Well, it wasn't always what we were doing. So if we rewind to when AvLaw actually started, it was founded by, coincidentally, actually one of my old lecturers from university. He was lecturing aviation law and regulations at the University of New South Wales here in Sydney. And basically the genesis of the company at that stage was there was a big boom in the mining sector here, which in light of some incidences which, unfortunately led to some fatalities, it sort of sprung them into action to instill or introduce a new level of oversight of the airlines that were being contracted by these mining and resource companies. So basically what we started doing, and for a period of probably a couple of years before we started to get involved with the construction and development side of the aviation sort of consulting business, was oversight and safety and compliance audits of these operators, some of which were based here in Australia, others in Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, others in Africa and South America, where all the local regulations would often differ. But from a contracting company's point of view, they want to sort of standardize their risk profile, and they ask companies like us to get in there and see if what can be improved and to help them do it.
And then what's different and what's the same about doing that work, which was mostly for mining companies, and now doing it for developers and other people in the construction and design industries?
Well, I think the stark difference, which is obvious, is that the property developers or the architects or the town planners, whoever they are that we're sort of advising on building heights or crane heights, they're not in aviation. So this is sort of seen as an extra sort of consideration that has had to be taken into consideration now, mainly due to just market forces here, particularly on the east coast of Australia, where there's been a lot of, booming in the property market, a lot of rezoning by councils to relax building height controls. For a long time, the councils were the ones that were defining the building envelopes. Now you've got these precincts that are being sort of earmarked as priority areas to, essentially promote development and taller buildings. And so all of a sudden this airspace limit, which before was sitting above and beyond the council limits, is now being called into question. So that's, I think, the main difference, is just a degree of consciousness about this factor being taken into consideration. Because as we know, there are a host of other things that need to fall into place before a building gets off the ground. And it's in some instances, as we've found, it's often overlooked. We've given advice on some developments that were 40 floors off the ground before they realized the cranes might be at issue.
So what do they do in that case?
Well, they probably had their hearts in their mouths for a period of time before they figured out that there was companies like us that could potentially sort of get them out of jail. But in that situation, it's a matter of really just assessing the impact of what this proposed activity is. So be it the building itself, or more likely in those instances when it's after the fact, is generally dealing with the cranes. So we're talking about temporary sort of penetrations, because clearly these things have to go higher than the finished building height.
So in that case, you can negotiate with the airlines or whoever it is that's potentially being interfered with?
Yeah, so we don't necessarily directly deal with the airlines, but
with the regulator.
With the regulator, generally via the airport authority or the airport operator that's affected. So if it's something in the CBD here, you'd be dealing with Sydney Airport, who then obviously have a requirement to, liaise with the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, Air Services Australia, which provide, air traffic control, and ultimately the Department of Infrastructure and Regional Development, which either issues the approval or says you can't do it. And
you're based here in Sydney. Is Sydney a particularly tough case for this kind of work, because you've got a major airport very close to downtown?
You do, and I guess this is part of the debate that's taken place here, in the sense that, often we're compared with other global cities, because we do consider ourselves to be a global city, and we look at the skyline and we say, well, why are there 500-600 meter skyscrapers in other global cities, and why are we being told that the aeronautical impact of my building is no good? So it's a long-winded answer, and I'd probably advise people to maybe watch the video of the presentation I gave for us a bit of context. But essentially, Sydney has been shifting a lot, and I gave the example of the trends in terms of the raw data, the number of actual applications that the Department of Infrastructure has been receiving.
Yeah.
In 2010, it was something like 70. Last year, it was 300.
Wow.
So, I mean, if, for the architects, the developers, if they were monitoring any other indicator of the industry and it had increased by fourfold in the last 6 years, they would definitely take notice of it. But this has almost crept up on them because, as I said, they're just not in aviation.
Yeah. Well, and then one thing that might change this picture too is that Sydney's considering, or some people are pushing for, another airport further out.
Correct. Yeah, and that's actually been approved now. So that is happening. It was Sydney Airport as part of their terms of the lease, which they currently acquire, where they had first right of refusal, which meant within, I think it's like 100 kilometres of the Sydney basin, if there was ever to be a second airport proposed, they had the first option to operate it if they wished. For a variety of factors, mainly the financial viability of it not stacking up for them, they said no thanks. So now the government is taking it on and delivering that airport, which will be at the Badgerys Creek site, which has been earmarked for our second airport for decades now, and it's finally happening and due to be operational sometime during the mid-2020s.
How do you anticipate that affecting your work with tall buildings in Sydney?
Well, it could be, it's 8 or 9 years away from being operational, but we're already having to deal with it. We've got inquiries from developers that, I mean, it's not a coincidence that Western Sydney has been the area that has been, identified as a potential location for a second airport. It's supported by, a massive economy that's only growing.
Right.
And so, whereas before there wasn't really a business case for building tall out that way.
Now in Parramatta, people want to build up, and there's metro lines and transport out west.
Exactly, and I think it's something like 7 billion or something that's been sort of allocated towards infrastructure projects in general, in total. A lot of that's going to go towards developing Western Sydney and really turning Parramatta, as you say, into more of a hub than it even already is. And as I said, going back to, I guess, how it's affecting us already, we get calls from developers to say, hey, we're thinking about buying this site. The council's not really enforcing any height limits. Tell us how much the airport's going to affect how tall I can build. And we sort of can't answer that question yet. It's sort of uncharted territory for us. Anyway, for me personally, having been in this industry, for 7-8 years now, we haven't had to take into consideration a new airport being built. So,
well, a lot of these projects also probably have timelines that are just as long, right? 8-9 years, maybe more. If you're talking about building a giant development to get the land, the financing, the construction all done, the permitting.
Exactly. Yeah. So look, I don't envy the position they're in to try and convince themselves or their stakeholders or their shareholders whether it's a good decision or not. But we do our best. We have given some sort of high-level sort of preliminary advice as far as what could potentially be achievable or realistic, mind you. But it does take, you have to take it with a grain of salt.
Now, you did this work in the airspace consulting field for the Barangaroo development.
Correct.
Tell me about that. How'd that go? What were some of the concerns about airspace and air rights there?
Yeah, so
how'd you resolve them?
That one was an interesting one. I guess we, at the time, didn't quite realize what was, I guess, what you call some of the controversy behind the development before we sort of got involved with it. But we very quickly found out that the airspace issue was just one of a range of sort of things they were sort of fighting off. But that laid out the template for us essentially as far as how to manage a really high scale, high profile development and really introduced us to that.
And just for some context, in case people listening aren't familiar with the Barangaroo, 3 large towers, ground level retail, and kind of a pedestrian mall on the former industrial harbor front. kind of on the edge or just outside of the CBD in
Correct.
Sydney. So
Yes.
what were the airspace issues that you had to resolve?
So in that sense, we had a penetration of, I guess, some various surfaces which were otherwise, I guess, protected from obstacles. And I guess that was supported by virtue of us conducting an aeronautical assessment to I guess, justify why the development, if it were to proceed, factoring in both, as I said, the building as well as the cranes, why it would not have a detrimental effect on the regularity of aircraft flying in and out of Sydney Airport.
And were you able to make that case successfully, or did the designers have to change the design at all?
No, thankfully, neither on that project nor anything else that we've actually managed have we had to tell the developer to say, you need to chop off a few floors or lower your crane or use a different crane. It's been a pretty successful ride for us so far.
Well, that's interesting. Do you think I find that interesting that you've never had to go back to the developer and tell them to change anything? So either they're just anticipating correctly what they can do, or you're very successful at making sure the government agrees with your clients.
Well, yeah. Well, I'd like to think it's more the latter. As I said, that project itself that sort of got us off the ground. It actually wasn't initially the Barangaroo one. It was development up in Brisbane for Meriton, and the predicament they were in was that they were some way throughout the construction of their building before they realised that the cranes were going to be penetrating the airspace limit. So that was definitely, I guess, exposed us to the more challenging assessments that we had to manage. So anything since then has been slightly less complex or time pressure sensitive, I guess you could say.
Do you have any sense of how common it is for developers or architects to actually contract with an airspace consultant like you? I mean, do most people forego this, and what's your advice to them?
Yeah, I think, look, my advice is, to not ignore the trends, and everything that I've heard over the last few days here has been quite sort of inspiring, and it's great to see the mentality of sort of everyone knowing that they contribute a little bit of a big pie here. And, you've got the town planners and the architects and, structural engineers and the guys giving you the lifts and all this just combination of all this talent and skill and know-how. My advice is to include the aviation stakeholders as part of that conversation, because no one has benefited from leaving them out. And it only creates problems down the track if, a building is not going to go higher than it should unless it's managed in a coordinated manner with the airport, with the aviation safety regulator, and really acknowledging the total impact. And I completely understand. I've spoke to developers where they're being asked by even local councils to say, we're not going to let this pass through, for example, a stage 1 DA or even a planning proposal stage of a development process until you've had that aeronautical assessment done. And the reason for that is down to, I think, a few factors. I think it's being acknowledged that this is a problem, but also some instances where, for example, you've had some hospital helipads actually shut down because cranes have been encroaching on the approach and departure paths. So that's a terrible outcome for everyone, obviously, because we don't want a hospital helipad that's obviously being used for, life-saving purposes to be shut down for months on end and forcing the aircraft to land 200-300 meters down the road, which could lead to, an untimely death or something terrible happening to someone. So I think that has definitely been highlighted, and I think that's sort of had a ripple effect in terms of how development applications are handled in general.
Is that a real-world example of a hospital helipad being shut down?
Yeah, so we had an instance here in Sydney at Nepean Hospital. That's in Sydney's west, not too far from where the Western Sydney Airport is due to be constructed. And and yeah, that was exactly as I explained. They had a development, I think it was a residential tower that was being built, and clearly it had not been taken into consideration from a DA point of view, because the development had been, mid-construction, the cranes are up, and only then did they realise that, these cranes are obviously going to be in the flight path of these helicopters. And
What was the result of that? Did they have to move?
they had to close the helipad down for
Wow.
a number of months. So that was exactly the example.
Did the client have to provide any compensation or anything for that?
That I'm not sure of,
Okay.
to be honest with you. That I'm not sure of, but I think the real net outcome of that is,
not ideal.
Is terrible.
Yeah.
So a learning curve for everyone, but I guess it identified a gap, and I guess it all comes with education. I guess
Sure.
a lot of the local councils now are really taking it upon themselves to address this up front. And so I guess going back to what you originally asked in terms of, are we being engaged, or, as far as our profession, are we more in demand and whatnot from developers and the likes? I think the answer is yes, and the earlier that they can factor it in, the better it is for them. So
one more question. Is the proliferation of drones affecting your business much? I mean, now you've got everyone able to buy and fly a drone around, and I imagine that creates problems for you potentially.
Yeah, look, it definitely creates problems for some of our clients. I mean, we do a little bit of advisory work in that space. I personally have my drone pilot license, which I acquired purely, and not as a some sort of career move or anything, just purely to develop an appreciation for the airmanship that's needed. Because and I certainly did. I'll be honest with you. Once all the aids and whatnot are switched off, these things are not that simple to control.
Yeah.
And so the impact it's having is, well, the application of it is, we've heard it so much. There's so many benefits of incorporating this amazing technology, but the issue still remains regulating it and controlling it. As you say, it's we could walk out of here and buy a drone in the next 10 minutes and be flying it over the CBD where we're not supposed to.
Right.
How do you police it? What do you do about that? So it's not necessarily affecting our work specifically, but definitely is affecting our clients, the airlines that we consult to, in particular, and other stakeholders that I guess we do deal with. For example, Sydney Airport or Brisbane Airport Corporation, when we're doing these sort of applications for property developers and whatnot, we know they're experiencing it because, it's causing some issues, and they're spotting a lot of them where they're not supposed to be, and there's it's unfortunate. I think it is just a matter of time before we learn the hard way.
Well, Amin Hamzavian, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much.